Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure to be lecturing in this respected community in Mahfil Ali. And today, inshallah, we'll be speaking about Imam al-Jawad and how do we connect with our Imam reasonably. So I think all of us have a connection with the Imam, right? At least we know something about him, at least his name, if we know anything at all. So we do know something about the Imam. But the question is, that connection that we have with the Imam, is it reasonable or is it not reasonable? So today I'm going to be speaking about four things. First, I'm going to speak about what does it mean to have a reasonable connection with the Imam and why is that important. Number two, I'll be speaking about what is the right way to approach historical events and matters. Number three, how to deal with historical sources. And number four, a brief history over Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Reasonably connected. Well, it's a very simple definition, a straightforward one. When I say reasonably connected with the Imam, meaning that the relationship between me and the Imam is a relationship based on evidence. Like, it's not just an emotional relationship. No, it's a relationship that I can actually support when I need to support it. That's what I mean by a reasonable connection. And yeah. So how do we apply it with the Imams? Meaning that we should have a reasonable connection with them. We need to know the things that we do know about the Imam and try to support with the right evidence. So that entails three main things. First of all, when we study the life of the Imam, we study the life of the Imam not to prove anything. Like we shouldn't go to the historical books and we have that intention to prove something. We should go to the historical books and see what's there. If there was something that supports the idea that first triggered me to go do the research, then that's good. But we shouldn't go to the historical books and say that, you know what, I want to prove this. Because that's a bias. That's a bias that you start off with. And everybody can have that bias. So it's only reasonable to start off with what? With no bias. And when you start off with no bias, it means you go to the historical books and see what it has to offer. That's the first thing that entails if you want to connect yourself reasonably with the Imam. Number two, your job as an investigator. You're trying to investigate in history. Okay? So it's like an inspector. Not Inspector Gadget, but inspector. So you got to inspect, you got to see what's mentioned in history, and based on what's mentioned over there, you start drawing conclusions. Number three, when you do your historical investigation, it's not a polemical investigation. And what do I mean by that? You're not doing the historical research because you want to defend something. That's a bias. You should go to history and you should see what's there, and then, based on what's there, you start drawing conclusions. If you're just going in the intention of defending, you got a Wahhabi speaking to you that, your Imams are not, for example, infallible because he doesn't know everything. Oh, they're not infallible because he made a mistake over here. Now, the intention that you do the research is that I want to defend his infallibility. No worries. That can be the start-off intention, but the question is, do the research. Let the research draw the conclusion, not the predisposition or the presumption that you had before doing the research. So these three things are going to exclude any bias that you have once you want to do the research. So the first thing, if you want to be reasonable with your connection with the Imam, is you try to exclude any bias. Okay? Sorry. So that's why that's the first point. The second point, why is that important? Because we're claiming that we're righteous, and if you're right, that means you believe in the right thing, and if you believe in the right thing, that means what? That means you claim that you're right, and if it's right, that means you need to have the right evidence, or else you can't call yourself to be righteous if you don't have the right evidence. So that's why it's important for us to what? To know why we're doing the research. Number two, approaching historical events. I'm going to speak about 2 points over here. The first point is, when you want to prove anything in history, okay, how are you going to prove it? Let's come to easy examples. Let's not go so far. Anything that happened in World War II, how are we going to prove that? It's usually narrations. We either get it through a chain of narrators, right? Like let's say we've got 3 mediums between me and the person who attended World War II. That's one way. Another way is that you just find it in reports. Like you see a book in front of you, it's written 500 years ago. He's not mentioning no chain of narrators. He's just mentioning the report. He's just saying this and this and this happened. And that's what you find in Islamic history. In Islamic history, you've got 2 types of books. You've got books that mention the narrations, so they have the whole chain of narrators, and you've got books that don't mention. A book that does mention the narrations, the chain of narrators, like Al-Tabari, like Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, like Tabaqat ibn Sa'ad, Tabaqat al-Tabarani in all of his books. So these are books that do mention, but you've got books that don't mention. A book that doesn't mention, a famous book that we use as Shia history, is Al-Irshad for Shaykh al-Mufid. That's a book that doesn't mention the chain of narrators. But as I said over here, I'm not trying to say what's right and what's wrong. I'm just trying to say that history, this is how we understood history. It's either narrated and we see the chain of narrators, or it's a book that we found and we're reading the report that's mentioned over there. That's the first thing that we need to know about history. The second thing is, what is it in history that you want to prove? What is it in history that you want to prove? Look, if you want to prove anything in history, it's usually 4 things. You either want to prove an event or the details of that event, or you want to prove the existence of a person or the details of that person. It's usually one of these 4 things. Now, let me give you an example. In history, sometimes we want to prove the Battle of Nahrawan. The Battle of Nahrawan is something that happened in history, right? Okay. If you want to prove the existence of the battle, that's one thing. But sometimes you want to prove the details of the battle. You want to say that, why did that battle kick off? Or who were the 2 main leaders? Or how much was the casualties at the time? So these are details of the event. So you got the event and you got the details of the event. And sometimes you want to speak about personalities, the existence of a personality. Like who? Like a controversial one, Abdullah ibn Saba. I'm sure many have heard of that name. Even amongst the Shia, it's not something that is agreed upon. Some scholars believe that he did exist, and some scholars believe that he didn't exist. And the scholars that did believe that he did exist, they just said that he didn't have that much influence. He did exist, but he didn't have that much influence. So that's the second point. Like when we want to approach history, the first thing we need to do is we need to know what is it in history that we want to prove, because everything that you want to prove has its own methodology. It's like any other science. So why am I speaking about the historical events? Because we said in the beginning that proving anything, any characteristic of the Imam is going to be through what? Through history. You're going to see narrations or reports. Yes, there are some characteristics that you would prove rationally. An example for that would be infallibility, for example, al-isma. Al-isma for some scholars, especially like the old scholars like Shaykh al-Mufid, Sharif al-Murtada, speaking about 5th, 6th century, 7th century, they call them al-mutakallimin. They believe that the isma and the infallibility of the Imam is something that you prove rationally. So they wouldn't go to Hadith al-Ghadir to prove the rationality. They wouldn't go to Hadith al-Thaqalain to prove the rationality. They'll say it's actually proven through, it's proven through our rationality. That's how they'll prove the isma of the Imam. So that's why I'm not going to speak about the rational characteristics that we're going to prove for the Imam. We were speaking about the historical ones, like the ones that actually were proven in narrations or reports. The third, and as we said, we need to do an investigation and we need to know what we want to prove for us to move forward. The third thing is going to be, what are the main sources of investigation when you want to do that investigation? Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. There are 2 steps to take if you want to know the right sources and what are the main sources. You want to determine them, right? The first thing is you need to know what's there. Like, what are the sources? What sources do we have? Now, many of us can't do that research because you need to be a specialist in the field, right? If you're not a specialist, you can connect with specialists and they can save you the energy of doing the research. And that's something that you can find in books. That's something you can find like scholars you can get in contact with. They'll help you out with that. So that's the first thing. You need to determine what's there. See, we're doing the same thing over here. We need to see what are the sources. After you know the sources, then you start differentiating between the sources, which is the second step. You have to build a hierarchy between the sources that you know. Now, let's say you've got 10 books, all of them are on history, right? Now, if I have a narration from this book, let's say I have a narration from At-Tabari, and I have a narration from a different book, right? What if these two narrations contradict one another? What do I do in this situation? I can't resolve this situation only if I've already built a hierarchy between the sources. I need to know what's more reliable. Based on the source that's more reliable, I'm going to progress. And I'm going to prioritize this particular narration and not that, because this narration is in a more reliable source. And it can get more specific and specific. Yes, it's getting a bit technical, but that's the way to do the right investigation. Okay? Number 4, I'm going to give a brief history of Imam al-Jawad, and we're going to try to apply what we mentioned previously in that brief history. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Imam al-Jawad, he was born in 195, 10th of Rajab, 195 al-Hijri in al-Medina. So that's like 1,200 years ago, a bit more. And he passed away at the end of Dhul Qa'dah, 220 al-Hijra. So he was basically 24, 25 years old. Now my question is, how do we prove that? Now let's apply what we just spoke about over here. So if you want to prove things like this, what do? You go to the historical books, you go to the narrations, and you go like to the main sources. Bihar al-Anwar, for example, is a source, right? But it's not an old source. Bihar al-Anwar, Allam al-Majlisi, he died 400 years ago. So the gap between him and the narrations was how long? Like it's more than 700, 800 years. So he can't be a main source. Bihar al-Anwar is a very big book, and he brings his reports from other sources. So we have to return to the main sources, right? So if you ask me, where was this mentioned that he was born in 195 al-Hijra? Now you're going to find that, for example, in Al-Kafi. Now that's an old source, because Al-Kafi, he died in 326 al-Hijra. Al-Kulayni, his name is Kulayni, the author of Al-Kafi. And he narrates through a chain of narrators that would return to who? That would return to the Imam or to one of the companions of the Imam. Okay? So that's where you're going to find these things. And that's one of the ways of proving it. So you're finding Al-Kafi mention it, and then you find other scholars mention it. So when you see all of these scholars mention that he was born in 195 al-Hijra, that's something you can say you can accept. But now you're going to go into the details. Was he born in 10th of Rajab or something else? Now here it gets a bit more sticky. It gets a bit more troubling, because these dates, some of them are not that specific and some of them are specific. It really depends. Like we know that 10th of Karbala is specific, but what about the other dates? Not all of them are specific, and that's something you would find very clear. Like Fatima al-Zahra, for example. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Fatima al-Zahra, for example, the biggest mawsu'a, which is like a collection on Fatima al-Zahra that I've seen, is written by somebody called Shaykh al-Ansari, something al-Ansari. Not the old Ansari, he's alive right now. The mawsu'a and the collection is about 30 volumes. So each volume speaks about something, related to Fatima al-Zahra. He's got a whole volume on just the wilada of Zahra. So what does that show you? It shows you that there's lots to be said in that field in terms of how the wilada was, and there's lots to be said in that field in terms of what date it was. He brought, I think, around 20, 30, 40 different opinions. So, as I said, when it comes to dates, sometimes it's tricky, sometimes it's not. You can't always just take it for granted and you just move on. So as I said, that's the first thing that I mentioned about Imam al-Jawad, and as I said, it's a majority's opinion that he was born in 195. So that's something we can accept. The second thing, he was known to be generous. They use this word in Arabic as sakha. Sakha means al-karam, which is generosity. Now, how can we prove that he's generous? We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to the reports and we're going to go to the narrations, right? Now, if we're going to go to the reports and narrations, we're going to see that even Sunni scholars mention that. So when you know that the Sunni scholars have no bias towards proving anything for your Imam, they, like, for example, a Sunni scholar that all of you know, Ibn Taymiyyah mentions that. He mentions it in his in one of his books. And Ibn Taymiyyah died in 726 al-Hijrah, 700 years ago approximately. Al-Dhahabi mentions it when he speaks about Imam al-Jawad, and Dhahabi died around 700 years ago. He died in 774 al-Hijrah approximately. As-Safadi in one of his books called Al-Wafil Wafiyat, who died 764. So you got all of these Sunni scholars that are mentioning that he was what? Generous. And at the same time, you know that they have no bias towards proving that he's generous. So therefore you can say, yeah, it's much more easier for me to accept that the Imam was actually generous. So as I said, every aspect, every detail that you want to prove in history, it has to be based on something. And it gets more troubling when we speak about events that we're quite emotional with. Like, let's say, for example, events about Karbala, right? We might be very emotional with Karbala, and then we realize that many of the things might not be really based on something that we can prove through history. And sometimes, no, it is. You can actually prove a lot when it comes to Karbala because we have old traditions, like Maqtal Abi Mukhnaf and other narrators as well. Even like Maqtal Abi Mukhnaf is taken from Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari, he narrates from Maqtal Abi Mukhnaf, and the book that we have on Maqtal Abi Mukhnaf is actually extrapolated from Al-Tabari. And we've got other sources as well. We've got sources like Tabaqat ibn Sa'd. He also mentions the history of the Imam. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now I want to name a couple of companions of the Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. And this is a problem that we face in general. The word Sahaba, okay, the word Sahaba isn't a word that Shia like. Okay, at least a lot of Shia, I don't know, they get a bit sensitive when it comes to the word Sahaba because you've got an opposing opinion that tries to defend everything the Sahaba done. So that's why you get a bit sensitive when it comes to that word. And unfortunately, that created, you can say, a culture between the Shia that if I tell them who are the ashab of the Nabi, he would name only 4 or 5. Who are they going to name? Ammar ibn Yasir, who else? Maghdad. It would just name a couple of names, right? And these Sahaba are the Sahaba of who? Imam Ali as well. So that's why I think it's really important that once we read the history of the Prophet, Imam Ali, the rest of the Imams, we need to know their companions. Their companions are the ones who helped them propagate. Or else, you know, the Imams, lots of the Imams, they weren't living in the best times. They were living in very delicate times. One of the main companions of Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam is Ahmad ibn Isa al-Ash'ari al-Qummi. Any person who reads hadith would be familiar with this name. Because in Al-Kafi, at least Ahmad ibn Isa ibn Isa al-Qummi, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa al-Ash'ari al-Qummi. He's mentioned in Al-Kafi at least 500, 600 times. So he's a very big, he's a very famous companion. And he's known to be the first person who actually settled down in Qum. He's the one from the Ash'ari family who settled down in Qum. And then the Ash'ari, the lineage of Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa, all came over there and lived in Qum. And that's why Qum right now is known to be a Shia, the hub of Shia, scholars and non-scholars. Number 2, the second, as a very big companion, was Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Abi Nasr al-Bazanti. Now, he's also a famous scholar, and he's a Kufan. He's from Al-Kufa. He was famous amongst the narrators, and he was also famous amongst the Shia community itself. He's a very big scholar, and same thing applies over here, that if you go to Al-Kafi, if you go to our main sources, you're going to find his name mentioned again and again and again. The last name that I'm going to mention for today is Ali ibn Mahzayar. Ali ibn Mahzayar is also a very famous scholar. You're going to find hundreds of narrations in Al-Kafi and other books. All of them are the companions of Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. And there's something we might not know about Ali ibn Mahzayar. In the beginning, and at first, he was a Christian, which is something, I don't know. I didn't know before I done the preparation, to be honest. I knew the name, but I didn't know that he was a Christian before that. And then he didn't just become a Muslim, he became a devoted Muslim, and he became somebody who actually propagated the Turath of Ahl al-Bayt and the traditions of Ahl al-Bayt. He's written a lot of works, and the majority of his works are in fiqh, jurisprudence. That's the majority of works. He's got like at least 40, 50 books. Now, let's apply the same thing that we said before and what I just mentioned. So how did I know that Ahmad ibn Isa ibn Muhammad ibn Isa al-Ash'ari is a companion of Imam Jawad? How did I know that Ibn Bazanti was a companion? How did I know that Ali ibn Mahzayar? So when it comes to narrators and companions, there are sources, they are very famous sources, and we're going to mention some of them today, and we're going to leave the rest for whenever somebody is interested in reading them. So one of the main sources is Rijal al-Najashi. Rijal al-Najashi, a very famous scholar. Rijal means men. The literal meaning of Rijal means men. But what he means over here is basically narrators or people who were Shia and who had books. Not necessarily Shia. The majority of the people and narrators that I mentioned in Rijal al-Najashi are Shia, but other than Shia are mentioned over there as well. Rijal al-Najashi, he died in, I think, 454 al-Hijrah, something like that. He definitely died in the 5th century, but I think it's 454 al-Hijrah. That's one of the main books, because what he done in that book is he wrote the whole book. The whole aim of the book is to prove that the Shia, they have scholars, and these scholars have written books. So he would mention the name of the scholar, a full name, where he lived, what he worked. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work, and he would speak about the books. He's like Rijal al-Najashi, he's concerned with the books of that scholar. So what would he do? He would do this. He would say that his books are this and this and this. Let's say Kitab al-Ghayba, Kitab al-Salah, and Kitab al-Hajj. He will say that Kitab al-Salah, I have a chain of narrators that return to that book. So he would say that I would narrate that book through this chain of narrators. So we'd mention 1, 2, 3 mediums until he reaches that book. That's what Rijal al-Najashi done in the book. And the same thing applies with Fahrist al-Tusi. Shaykh al-Tusi, he's a very amazing scholar. I think there's two very famous and very you can say a scholar that wrote in every single field. Shaykh al-Tusi is one of them, and Al-Allam al-Hilli. Shaykh al-Tusi, he wrote in everything. I don't think there's something that a man would think of that he didn't write on. I'm exaggerating, but at the end of the day, he wrote a lot, okay? And he wrote on everything. But he wrote in fiqh, he wrote in kalam, theology, he wrote in rijal. And the amazing thing about his books is that nearly every single one of his books are considered to be not just a book in the field, the main book in the field, which makes it quite, amazing. Same thing with Allam al-Hilli. Allam al-Hilli, he died 300 years after Shaykh al-Tusi. Allam al-Hilli died in 727. He was a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Taymiyyah's book, his main book is Minhaj al-Sunnah. That's the refutation he wrote against the Shia. So what was that refutation of? It was a refutation of Al-Allam al-Hilli's book. Allam al-Hilli wrote a book called Minhaj al-Karama. He died in 726, and there's only 1 year difference between Ibn Taymiyyah and Allam al-Hilli. One of them died in 726, one of them died in 727. So he wrote that refutation on Minhaj al-Karama, on Allam al-Hilli's book. So that's that. So just to summarize what we mentioned, I think we're coming to an end. I said we want to connect with the Imams reasonably and rationally, And that means that we believe in what we believe in the Imam based on evidence. And then we spoke about the historical evidence because the majority of characteristics are proven through history. So if you're going to bring a historical evidence, what's the way that you're going to prove it? We said, what is it in history that you want to prove? Do you want to prove an event, details of an event, a personality, details of that personality? And then we said, what are the main sources and how do you build your methodology? You need to build a hierarchy between the sources. And then we gave a couple of examples on the Hayat of Imam al-Jawad. And I think that's enough for today. It's quite technical, I know. I know some of you got bored, don't tell me you didn't. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions,
Yeah,
so
go
if
ahead.
anyone has any questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
If we're sort of doing our own research, so after the Quran, there's Al-Kafi that we can read. You mentioned Shaykh Al-Matusi, or
Yeah, Shaykh
wha-
Al-Tusi.
what should be what should be the next step after, say, Al-Kafi? If someone's new or if someone wants to do their own research, what would you advise?
Yeah, that's a nice question. What do you want to like? You need to determine what exactly you want to know, and based on what you want to know, I would mention the sources. For example, if you want to know fiqh, if you want to like jurisprudence, you want to know the teachings of Islam, you would return to Al-Kafi. You would return to Man La Yahdhuruhu Al-Faqih. That's written by Shaykh Saduq, who was 2 generations after Al-Kafi. He died in 381 Hijrah. You would return to Shaykh Al-Tusi's books, Al-Istibsar, and you would also return to his other book, Al-Tahdhib, Tahdhib Al-Ahkam and Al-Istibsar. These are the main fiqh books. There are other fiqh books. Some of them are controversial, some of them are not controversial. But these are the main things when it comes to fiqh. When it comes to history, which is what I think you're asking about, right? Like not the teachings of Islam, because the teachings of Islam is a very hard work. Like it needs somebody who's really specialized in the field. If you're speaking about historical events and matters and like things that are concerned with history, you can take what's mentioned in Al-Kafi. In Al-Kafi, the first volume, Kitab al-Hujjah. So if you go to Kitab al-Hujjah in the first volume, even though Al-Kafi, look, Kafi is a very important book, so I'd like to speak about it a bit. It's split into 3 parts. It's split into Usul al-Kafi, Furu' al-Kafi, Rawdat al-Kafi. Usul al-Kafi mentions anything got to do with Aqidah, theology, your beliefs, your doctrines, okay? And it mentions also in the beginning, like it's even 2 volumes itself. The first volume it speaks about general things, about talab al-ilm, seeking knowledge, about a bit of tawheed. It speaks about tawheed. Then it speaks about al-a'imma alayhim salam. So it speaks. This is the historical part of it. So you go take the history in Al-Kafi, and then the second volume speaks about morals, ethics. Things are like it gets very specific when it speaks about ethics. So you go to Kitab al-Hujjah and you take that part. By the way, Al-Kafi, the first volume is translated, so there's a translation if Arabic is not a language that you can access. So you take that part. Okay, I think that's the most reliable place that you can take the hadith from in terms of history. And then you can take some of what's mentioned in Al-Irshad for Shaykh al-Mufid. And then you have other Shia historical sources such as Waqi'at Siffin, the Battle of Siffin, written by Nasr ibn Mazahim. I think that's the oldest book that is written in history, like in Islamic history, and it's written by a Shia. There's a scholar right now. He's an Iraqi scholar. He wrote a mu'jam, like basically he mentions the names of the scholars who have written books, a bibliography basically of the Shi'i historians. And it's like 2 big volumes. So he would mention from the beginning of history till the end. As I said, it depends how deep you want to get, based on the depth that you want. Like I can tell you what, like basically a quick recommendation. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered the question.
Some of it.
Okay, what is that some that I didn't answer?
I don't want to take up more time, but it's just yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, you're
I'll-
welcome. Sure.
Any other questions?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Thanks for the lectures,
You're
really
welcome.
informative. You mentioned going into history without a bias in your first part of the lecture. And it is fine to read. What happens when you come across incidents which contradict the fundamentals of our understanding of our characters that we revere?
Yeah.
What then?
Yeah, that's a cool question, I call it. It's a very good question. So, as I said, first things first, how is the rational approach to anything that you want to prove? First thing, you're going to come through the rational evidence, right? So if you manage to prove these rational things, these rational evidence, and it has a methodology as well that I didn't speak about, the rational methodology, which means studying logic, philosophy, theology. If you've proven something through these means, and then you find something in history that contradict these, like this information that you proved with your rationality, over here you're going to say, I'm going to prioritize the rationality. And that's what I'm saying. Let's come to a practical example to make things more clear. Let's come to infallibility, because that's a main question, I'll say. For the scholars that believe that infallibility is proven through the aql, which means your reason, rationality, they're going to say whatever comes in history is contradicting what I previously proved. Therefore, I can't accept it. That's straightforward, right? But what about the scholars that don't believe in that? The scholars that say that infallibility is proven through a hadith. Now, they're the ones that they're going to have to deal with it. And as I said, the majority of scholars right now, the approach that they do take is proving infallibility through hadith. Now, that's why if I ask you, what's your evidence on proving the infallibility of the Imam? What are you going to bring me? You're going to bring me ayat al-tathir. You're going to bring me what's the other ayah? Of ayat al-wilaya, for example. Or you're going to bring me hadith al-ghadir. See, you're proving it through what? Traditions. So that's the I'll say the general approach that scholars nowadays take, not the previous scholars. So if you're going to do it that way, you're going to say, okay, you're going to as I said, you're going to have to, it's going to be a gradual process. First things first, you need to prove what are your basics and fundamentals. And these fundamentals need to be proven, like there's a methodology of proving them. So let's say if you want to establish something in history, let's come to what Quran mentioned in history. Now these are going to be the fundamentals that I would base every historical event on in the future. And then it goes like that. Do you get what I'm saying? So it's a gradual process. You need to prove, and that's what Shaykh al-Sadr, that's what he used to always say. Shaykh al-Sadr, I'm sure you've heard of that name. Shaykh al-Sadr died in 1980. He was born in 1935 and he died in 1980, which makes him, he died 45 years old. Saddam killed him. So, Shaykh al-Sadr, this is what he used to say. He's like saying, unfortunately, with lots of, let's say, khutaba or lecturers or whatnot, they would start bringing the controversial things and they wouldn't start with the fundamentals. So he would say that, go establish the fundamentals, build your base, and then look at what comes after that. Like, don't prove a specific thing over here if you haven't proved that fundamental part. So it's all about starting from the other side, not from, you can say, the grey side. Start with the white and black. I don't know. Was that an answer? Oh, okay. I was expecting that. Don't worry. It's very normal to have more questions.
Okay, brother, how much credibility you would give to Tariq at-Tabari?
Okay, I would like to, I would like to speak about this practically. And what I mean by practically, I would like to speak about it. How did the scholars deal with Tariq al-Tabari? I wouldn't I think their experience are much more than my experience, so I'll just give their experience. If you come to Tariq al-Tabari, our scholars took the whole Maqtal Abi Makhnaf from Tariq al-Tabari. They accepted it. So that shows you a lot. that they actually do accept a lot of what's mentioned in Tabari. Like, strictly speaking, what Shia historical books do we have right now, like, that didn't depend on Sunni sources? Not a lot. Like, as I said, we have Irshad, that's a Shia historical work, and we have bits and bobs in Al-Kafi, some traditions here and there, maybe 50, maybe 100, maybe more, something like that. And the rest of history is taken from Sunni books, like Tarikh ibn Hisham, like Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, Musannaf ibn Abi Shaybah, Musannaf Abd al-Razzaq. The majority of our historical, like, the knowledge that we have on history are taken from these sources, especially when it comes to the history of the Prophet. Especially the history of the Prophet, like as I said, barely anything is taken from the Shia sources. And that's why I think that scholars do respect Al-Tabari, or at least take a lot of what's mentioned in Al-Tabari. Yes, when it comes to controversial matters like As-Saqifa, yeah. Now, over there they have a different approach. They'll say, well, over here, Sunnis have a bias, and we have a bias. So it's going to be a different ballgame. Do you get what I'm saying? So we're going to have to deal with it differently. We're going to have to build our own methodology. So it's going to be different. But when it comes to general things about the Prophet's life, the Sahaba of the Prophet, I don't see them rejecting it. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, I think we're going to end there because it's time for Salah. Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa